as we work through the book of Isaiah, you should not think that the prophecies that you read are chronological. In some cases, they're topically grouped. Chronological. If you're looking, Carolyn, there should be some sheets in the back there. Chronological is a somewhat recent Western way of thinking. And in the East in particular, their thinking is kind of spiral. One of the great challenges for working through the book of John is that John writes in a very Eastern sort of fashion, which means that his message kind of does like this. And he's making progress. You know, if it's, I guess you want to, he's making progress, but he's not sticking on a thought straight down the line. He's exploring it from this angle and this angle, and it almost seems to be on something else, and then he takes what he talked about and he brings it back again, and he keeps moving it ahead, but he defies a standard Western outline of things. And you find that in the Old Testament because they were Eastern thought rather than Western thought kind of folk also. So, the gospel writers feel free to arrange things from Jesus' life that fit a certain topic. And I think we can understand that way of arranging things, right? We like things arranged for us topically also, but we don't usually do it when we're working through some history or when we're doing working through some biography. We tend there to want to be more biographical and chronological, rather, more chronological. Was it William Faulkner? He's a stream of consciousness thing, and once in a while you have books that will constantly be going to flashbacks. Right, so you read a chapter, and then in order to fill something in, it takes you back. Or sometimes maybe if you're doing a series of books, you're reading about some 8-volume set on World War II. Well then instead of just working day by day from volume to volume, okay, so the war in North Africa, right, and then the war in Italy, and then the war in Western Front and Eastern Front, and the war in the Pacific, and so you'll have a volume on each of those. So you read something here that took place at the same time that something here goes on. So at any rate, when it comes to the book of Isaiah, there are some things that seem to be arranged somewhat topically, like this whole middle section that we're going to see and go through more briefly, that is the judgments on the nations. And what we had in the first chapter versus what we have here doesn't necessarily follow some weeks or years from one to the next. It's kind of topical. We're not going to get to the call of Isaiah to be a prophet until chapter 6. Obviously, that's not chronological. He was called, and then he did prophecy. He didn't try this out for a few months or a few years and then get the call, right? As though he was like in his internship in chapters 1 through 5. So, chapter 2, I want to read through the chapter here this morning, again, in its entirety. It's a little shorter than the previous one, 22 verses. And then we will look at a wider view of it, and then we will look at a little closer view of it. Isaiah chapter 2. This is what Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established, as chief among the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Many people will come and say, "Come, let us go up the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks." Might be a passage from this chapter. "Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Come, O house of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord. You've abandoned your people, the house of Jacob. They are full of superstitions from the east. They practice divination like the Philistines and clasp hands with pagans. Their land is full of silver and gold. There is no end to their treasures. Their land is full of horses. There is no end to their chariots. Their land is full of idols. They bow down to the work of their hands, to what their fingers have made. So man will be brought low and mankind humbled. Do not forgive them. Go into the rocks, hide in the ground from the dread of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty. The eyes of the arrogant man will be humbled, and the pride of men brought low. The Lord alone will be exalted in that day. The Lord Almighty has a day in store for all the proud and lofty, for all that is exalted, and they will be humbled. For all the cedars of Lebanon, tall and lofty, and all the oaks of Bashan, for all the towering mountains and all the high hills, for every lofty tower and every fortified wall, for every trading ship and every stately vessel. The arrogance of man will be brought low, and the pride of men humbled. The Lord alone will be exalted in that day, and the idols will totally disappear. Men will flee to caves in the ground, to holes in the ground, from dread of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty when he rises to shake the earth. In that day, men will throw away to the rodents and bats their idols of silver and idols of gold, which they made to worship. They will flee to caverns in the rocks and to the overhanging crags from dread of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty when he rises to shake the earth. Stop trusting in man, who has but a breath in his nostrils. Of what account is he? All right, more law, more gospel. Which one? Law on balance, and you got a fair amount of gospel with some of the promises about the future God has in mind, right? Beating the swords into plowshares, and a time of peace. So that there is some good news in the chapter 2. But I'd say on balance, there's a lot of confrontation of God's people. So looking at the chapter as a whole, there's a phraseology that comes up a number of times. Not exactly the same in each case, but similar conceptually. Verse 2 talks about in the last days. Verse 11, 17, 20 talks about God having a day in store. And about that day, and the day in store in verse 12. So this idea of there is a day. A little bit like, just wait till your father gets home. There is this sense of foreboding about this day. And it's a bit of a biblical and Old Testament trope in general about that day. Right? When we're talking about that day, we all have kind of a sense we're talking about a day of judgment. Now, in a context, it may be a more immediate judgment that God is bringing against his people, not necessarily the very last day. But often in the Old Testament, these things get pushed together a little bit. Or often it's not exactly clear which one. It may be back and forth between the two. So in order to understand these terms, it's helpful to understand how the Old Testament spoke of the progression of history and the additional understanding that we receive from the New Testament. So if you've got the handout, you've got the, let's see, can I put up a slide about this or not? Now that's coming in just a moment, so have that up there. But the Old Testament view is that the people were living in their era, right, in their time. And the thing that they were all waiting for was the coming of the Messiah. And then when the Messiah came, he was going to usher in the last times that would lead to the judgment. And so there was a 3-step sort of thing that they were looking to. This is this is based on kind of a phrase that I have used in class before, but we call it the telescoping of prophecy. That things that from our perspective, living on the other side of the coming of the Messiah, are wider apart, they didn't necessarily distinguish from where they were in history. So they thought Jesus coming and Judgment Day almost right on top of each other. And even during Jesus' ministry, when you read at the end of Matthew or the end of Mark or the end of Luke, his last times discourse, which is he's done with his time in Jerusalem, he's gone out to the Mount of Olives, the disciples ask him about the destruction of the temple, and he kind of transitions from that into the end of all things. It's before Maundy Thursday when he's initiating all the events that lead to the cross. But in that, too, you have a little bit of a telescoping of things where it's not always easy to tell. Is he talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD when the Romans come? Or is he talking about the end of all things at the end of time? and there are some similarities. So there's a little bit of that going on yet. When you hear about wars and rumors of wars and all, look back in the context and see, is it clear that that's the end at the end, or is this the Romans coming 40 years after Jesus is gone and taking Jerusalem out? So which judgment of God is in view? When you're waiting for one, that's not always entirely distinguishable. And in some sense, it's always the judgment of God, so it's maybe not so important that you distinguish which one, because folks are going to die and meet their Maker either way, right?
For people at the time of Jesus, didn't the Jews think that when the Messiah came, he would bring in the next age?
So
right
yes,
then.
right then, and Israel would be restored to glory.
Right.
And of course, that idea still spooks around Christianity today. This idea of Jesus coming for a great kingdom here on earth.
Right.
And that was not the view of the early church in general. There was a little debate back then. But if you look at the creeds, he ascended to the right hand of the Father, and what do we say? From there, he will come to establish a 1,000-year kingdom on earth. The creed says, from there, he will come to judge the living and the dead. That's the next big thing. That's the next big thing we're waiting for. But the Jews definitely had hope. The disciples had that hope, right? When Jesus ascended into heaven that very day, right before he goes up, what do they ask him? Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? And he says, go back to that room in Jerusalem and just hang out till the Holy Spirit comes on you. And then they seem to get it from there, right? But this was not always clear to them. And part of this is also...
Sorry.
But part of this is also that we have trouble distinguishing the spiritual kingdom from the physical kingdom. And they had a problem with that, and people still have a problem with that. So we want utopia on earth, a physical kingdom. And in the prophets, even in the Old Testament, when they're talking about Zion so often, they're not talking about a physical kingdom, as a material kingdom, a political entity, right? It's talking about the New Testament church. But the children of Israel didn't really have a frame of reference to properly evaluate and understand all of that. So God puts it out there, and he lets them deal with it in their context as they can, and move on from there. But so Old Testament era, the Messiah comes, you really have the last days and final judgment following pretty quick on that. So they probably didn't expect that when Israel gets elevated, there's going to be a long kingdom, because it's just going to lead pretty quick to the judgment. Now look up the following passages to see more specifically when the last days began. Acts 2:17. This is the Apostle Peter preaching on Pentecost Day. But this is not his words alone. Peter's actually quoting the prophet Joel. It's his sermon text. When Peter preaches on Pentecost Day, he doesn't just spin a topical sermon out of the top of his head like Jesus did kind of with the Sermon on the Mount. But he preaches more like we're used to. Here's my text. Okay, this is God's word. Please be seated. All right, now let's go talk expound this to you. But this is from the prophet Joel. In the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. Well, what is this prophecy talking about in history, according to Peter, in the context? When did God pour his spirit on all people, and people then prophesy, etc.?
Yeah, and when Jesus rose.
Okay, Jesus rises, he ascends, and Peter's preaching this on Pentecost Day. And he's trying to explain what's going on here on Pentecost Day. You heard this wind, you saw these tongues of fire split. You hear these men who are uneducated speaking in all kinds of foreign languages to you. What's that all about? Well, it's exactly what the prophet Joel said was going to happen. But in terms of how God sees it, when in history is that Pentecost Day from 2,000 years ago? In the last days. So, people will talk about, do you think we live in the end times? Yeah, we live pretty deep into them, like 2,000 years into them. Because the end times were inaugurated with Jesus' first coming. And ever since then, we've been living in the last time. So is the end near? Yeah, you got good reason to think the end is near. Because already Peter says we are living in the last days. And when you and this is why when you read Peter later in his letters, or when you read the Apostle Paul, or when you read John's letters, they all speak as though they fully expect Jesus to return during their lifetimes. But when Paul has this great resurrection chapter in Resurrection 15, he talks about how we'll all be changed, but we will not all sleep at the last trumpet. The dead will be raised, and we will be changed. And Paul's talking like he expects Jesus fully to return in his lifetime, raise the dead, and he and the people to whom he's writing that letter will still be alive. Now, he's not saying that as an ironclad thing for all of them, but he's speaking in terms of understanding where he is in the great sweep of history from God's point of view. They understood now how the Old Testament should be interpreted in light of Jesus coming. And Jesus talked to his disciples and said, hey, when you see these things happen, you've got to be ready. And, well, those things didn't happen during their lifetimes. But he said nobody knows that day or hour, right? But they had to be prepared as though it was going to happen in their lifetimes. The last days were upon them because the Messiah had come. And this much, in a sense, the Old Testament people had right. That when the Messiah came, the last days came. They just didn't understand nearly what a large span that was from a human point of view. Now, as Peter points out with the Lord, a day, how it finishes, is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. When you're eternal, 1,000 years is a drop in the bucket. But to us, it's a long time. To us, it feels like a long time. But to God, it's just another moment in history that he can see. Okay, so similar, Hebrews 1. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. Well, who's the Son who has spoken to us directly in these last days? That, of course, is Jesus. And so he is placing Jesus' ministry itself in these last days. James 5:3, your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. When were the people to whom James wrote living? In the last days. And there's a strong sense of warning there because it's almost the end. You can't be embracing worldly ways now. That's where you are historically, so be ready for it. Okay, so if you look at the New Testament view, we can kind of add a thing there. So the Old Testament, as they look back, they could say there was an Old Testament era in which God was preparing his people for the coming of the Messiah. Then the Messiah comes the first time. And then there's a New Testament era, an age of the Christian church, in which Jew and Gentile together become the people of God, and the whole experience that we have now. And then there is the second coming and judgment. So what the Old Testament people didn't see necessarily was that the Messiah comes twice, not just once. The Messiah comes, end of things, judgment. And from our side of things, we can see, well, it's not that that's wrong, it's just that it's incomplete. There's more to it. And it may bother us sometimes, but God has not always chosen to tip his hand on everything right away. His revelations come as he's seen fit. The Old Testament people would not have understood the Trinity like we can, because they didn't have all the information that we had. They knew who the true God was. They knew he had a son. They knew about the Spirit, but they had a little less information about that than we do. And it was a little less developed as a teaching. But they still knew who the true God was. So a way of diagramming it is like this. So if you're Isaiah, you look to what's, the Babylonian captivity. Here's where I live, and then the return, and then the Messiah is coming, and then the New Testament church, final judgment. It's hard to distinguish all of that because it's all out ahead. And where does one line end and the next begin? And some of this begins to blur together a little bit. And so even in Isaiah, as he's talking about God's judgment here with the captivity, how much that's this, does the Messiah's coming bring that to an, it's not always going to be completely clear. And in the New Testament, we can kind of take this whole thing, if you see, and turn it on its side so we can see how this lines up a bit better. Okay, a couple other passages then to look at here. Read Micah 4. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as chief among the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and people will stream to it. Many nations will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He'll teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between many peoples and will settle disputes for strong nations far and wide. They'll beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore." Where have I heard that before?
Second chapter. We just read it.
In
The second chapter
of
is Isaiah.
Isaiah, right?
It sounds like a duplicate passage.
Absolutely.
That got miscopied.
So is this a problem?
It kind of looks word for word.
It's close. Not exact, but it's pretty close.
Who was first? Micah was at the same time?
Yeah, they're contemporaries.
Contemporary.
Yeah. They're both prophesying to Judah at the same time.
Well, maybe Judah needs a double whammy.
We don't like plagiarism, but that's a first world problem. That's a concern of people who are all uppity about getting credit for what they put down on paper.
Well, people-
And if your message is coming from God in the first place, do you have to worry about that?
But the problem with God's people is, even though He warned them many times,
Mhm.
they wouldn't turn away from the sin. So, I mean, for the word to come twice is not.
Is it any worse necessarily than the Apostle Peter saying on Pentecost Day, "I'm going to go to Joel to explain this to you, and this is going to be my text, and I'll explain it." So we don't know who got it first, so it's two possibilities. If we believe the Bible is inspired, God could have given the same words in pretty much to both prophets who are contemporaries of each other. It is also possible that as they worked in different locations, one or the other came first, and God inspired one or the other to say, "That's pretty good. I should use that. I'll work that into my act," right? But it's not necessarily a problem that a very close message would appear twice to people who desperately needed to hear it. As you point out, they were kind of thick-skulled. They didn't get things the first time or the fifth time sometimes. We don't know timing-wise how much distance was between the giving of those messages either. There's something I wonder about. So I've only been here 10 years. I was in my previous congregation a little over 20 years. Do you notice that once in a while in my sermon I retell a story?
Never.
Thank you. I try not to. I try to, if I'm going to illustrate a point, I try to come up with a new story each time. But I don't even go through all my old sermons to, I think I used that back in 2015. I don't do that
Quote
necessarily.
Frodo about once a year.
Well, so there are certain quotes that live with me. As you know, the movie The Princess Bride, for whom the entire manuscript is quotable, may come up more than once and be used.
She says Dr. Seuss. Wow.
Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss got a lot of quotable stuff as well. But so whether it's a story from a ministry or a quote from a book, well, sometimes it just does the job. And if you don't mind hearing it a second time, it's not the whole sermon. I might trot it out again. Is that problematic?
People quote Shakespeare just in between dinner courses all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Or if you follow politicians and go to their rallies, and they've got what they call a stump speech, right? Oh my goodness, that's the same speech over and over and over again, and that's not exclusive to one party or politician or another. I've heard, the commentators, and the commentators aren't bothered by it, but yeah, they'll be talking on the news about this politician, this location, and bringing up a certain story, and it resonates with the people, etc. But it's a story that's been told many times over and over. So the fact that you would find both prophets using what's maybe surprising to us is you don't have more of that in Scripture. That might be something that would surprise us as much as anything. Inasmuch as you're coming to the same people and you have prophets or apostles who are contemporaries of each other and dealing with the same issues and that need that reinforcement. So it's an interesting thing here at the beginning of chapter 2 and Micah chapter 4 that you have that. But it's useful. Another old tip. Beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weakling say, I am strong. All right, why is this an interesting twist? Go ahead, Margaret.
It's the opposite.
It's opposite. So, is Joel contradicting Isaiah? Well, that's the thing. Okay, so we recognize that. Well, it's a little bit like Ecclesiastes. For everything there's a time and a season, and a time for, among other things in that list, there's a time for war and a time for peace. And so we have to understand also that there can be a time when the opposite has to happen, and God's people have to prepare for the fight. Probably, and I'd have to look, I didn't look real close at the context here. Sometimes that is a physical fight in Israel's case, because nation and religion were kind of one. For us in the New Testament, of course, we recognize that Christianity requires a fight of sort. The Apostle Paul talks about putting on the full armor of God. And we even talk about the church this side of heaven as the church militant. And we have hymns like Onward Christian Soldiers. And we get to the other side, then we're the church triumphant. Some churches kind of talk about themselves in such a way as to sound like they're already the church triumphant. And we've maybe been guilty of a little bit of that ourselves here and there. As though we've created the utopia and brought heaven on earth. And we should be careful of that, because we'll always be fighting the fight this side of heaven. The Apostle Paul says, fight the good fight. The good fight of faith. So that's a part of what has to happen also. So it takes the same picture, but it reverses it. It's not really problematic, but it recognizes that you have one source, and it's possible the prophets were reading each other. I mean, I read other pastors today sometimes. I've got some of their books on my shelves. I sit in front of them in a sermon. And I'll also tell you this, that not only have I told the same story more than once in my sermons, but sometimes I tell you stories that aren't mine. And if I was writing for an academic publication or a term paper, I would footnote it and all of that. But sometimes it just breaks the stream of communication to do all of that footnoting live while I'm delivering it, right? It just, as so-and-so said on this page of this book or on this sermon given on this date, and so by the time I get to that, it's like you tuned out. I just tell the story. I might say, someone once said, but that's all you need to know. And my goodness, if the journalist can say, well, I've got a secret source that you can't know about, and still expect anybody to believe it, which frankly I get more skeptical as the years go along. It's like, if you've got a secret source, if they don't have the courage of their convictions to come out and let themselves be known, then just shut up. Keep your mouth shut about that. I couldn't do that when I was writing. Well, I've got this quote here in my term paper, but and I got a footnote and said, from my secret source. I had a classmate who kind of tried that once. It didn't work. He was making up quotes and sources because he was late.
ChatGPT does that all the time. It quotes papers
that don't exist.
That don't exist from journals that don't exist.
Looks good though.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
it looks
sure.
great. You can, yeah.
All right. Well, anyway, I digress. At least it's nonpartisan. They both do it on both sides, right? The point is that it shouldn't surprise us that they would quote each other and that they read each other and that sometimes worked its way in. That's okay. That doesn't necessarily go against our concept of inspiration. How do the first 6 verses of chapter 2 differ from the message of chapter 1? So it's this, maybe we'd even say the first 5 verses. Well, back to this concept at least. In these first verses of chapter 2, law or gospel for the most part? Good news or bad news?
I'll go with gospel.
Absolutely, right? God's got a good future for Zion. I'm going to raise up the faith and the religion and the message and the people, and there's a day coming of great deliverance, and there's going to be no more war anymore, and it sounds almost utopian. So compared to chapter 1, which was so heavy on judgment and just had these little snatches about forgiveness here and there, he's definitely in the first half or first third here of chapter 2 on a much more upbeat and positive message. It kind of breaks the tension and lifts the people up again, as it's arranged at least in the book as it was put together. We don't know when these came in regard to each other, but it has a more positive sense. Okay, so just a few ideas here, a little bit more detailed about the verses. Those are kind of broad, sweep things. In verse 2, what other mountain may have seemed more prominent than Zion in human history? So, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as chief among the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. And why would that have been a problem? I could think of kind of 3 categories, 3 different ways of thinking about this in which other mountains could be considered of greater prominence than Mount Zion or Mount Moriah, really, on which the Lord's temple was built. We often talk about Jerusalem as Mount Zion. That's actually, Mount Zion was where David built his palace. Mount Moriah is the mountain on which the temple was built, in which the Temple Mount sits today. But in the Old Testament, eventually those two kind of get spoken of as one. And Zion is the one that sort of represents the whole of Jerusalem. Spiritually, what mountain, even in Israelite history, might have sometimes seemed more prominent, but that would be more problematic if it was the dominant one? Sinai. Yeah. If Sinai dominates, then where are you left? Law, right? And the people went that way at times. Part of the problem when Jesus came is that the Pharisees, the leaders of the people, were all about the law. They were looking for the Messiah, but they didn't even understand the Messiah in very gracious terms. So if Moses so dominated, then that could become problematic. It's in Hebrews chapter 12 where Sinai and Zion are held up as foils to each other, and the author, who's trying to convince these Jewish Christians not to go back to the synagogue, says, you don't want to live on Mount Sinai. That was scary. You want to come to Mount Zion, which then stands also for the Christian church in the age of Jesus, because there you're going to find all of God's blessings. So that would be one way of seeing it, I suppose. Politically, even during their time, I suppose, Alexander the Great's going to come through eventually, but if Mount Olympus was more dominant, politically than in their minds, or later the Romans come, and Roman is known, you maybe know, as the city built on 7 hills. You had the Palatine, the Capitoline, and et cetera, et cetera. But that would be a problem, perhaps. So in Athens, Greece, and the Agora, where that is up there on the where the Parthenon is. So that could be a problem. And then physically, I suppose, just in the Middle East and where they lived, they would have known about Mount Everest. But Mount Hermon, often supposed to be the place where Jesus was transfigured, and that was one of the few snow-capped mountains that they would have been aware of, and that's more to the north. But they needed to realize the prominence of the mountain that God had established for their faith and life and worship. And so when it talks about Zion being raised this way, here's where you have to understand the genre of prophecy. It's set in poetry. And he's not talking about some kind of earthquake shift that's going to push the hill on which Jerusalem is currently built up to, 26,000 feet, so that it's higher than Everest. That's not what that is saying. When he raises Zion, it means in terms of its prominence before the people, God's going to make this faith based on it, what this temple stood for, that to which all people look up. But it's not referring to some kind of a cataclysmic shift in the topography of the earth.
And metaphorical.
It's metaphorical, yeah.
But the Middle East and Babylon, I mean, they tried to build ziggurat, They tried to
so
build.
in many places where it was flat, they tried to build mountains, right?
Right.
So the ziggurat, and to what degree is that the pyramids of Egypt, or to what degree is that the pyramids type structures you have in Middle America? If you go to see the Mayans or the Incas did live in the Andes. They didn't really have to go too much higher than they already were, but in some very flat places, they attempt to create that kind of thing artificially. But the point still has to do more with the prominence worldwide. And we live in a time of fulfillment already about that. I mean, finally, when Jesus comes at the end, there will be no doubt for anybody. But already, not that we want to become triumphalist about this, but what is the biggest faith in the world? Christianity. By at least 500 million. Sometimes Islam seems to be catching up. But Christianity is the biggest and seems to spread the farthest and the fastest. And that is kind of fulfillment of this Mount Zion being lifted up from an Old Testament point of view, because they didn't have Jesus' name yet, but Jesus is the one who was associated finally with that temple and for whom that temple existed. It says it will be established. So you understand that there's kind of a permanent duration. This is, if you can read the Hebrew, the word established here is prominent. It's out of order in the word order, and it wants to emphasize this. When you write poetry, sometimes you put words in weird order so that you get the rhyme and the rhythm you want. And then we can make heads or tails of it, but anybody who would talk that way, it would be weird. Some of our hymns are that way, because you want to get the rhyming word at the end, and so you put things out of their natural English order. And the Hebrew wasn't about rhyme and rhythm so much, but they did have a natural order to how they put their sentences. We put subject first, predicate second, generally speaking. We can reverse them, but for the most part, Bill said this. So Bill, subject, said, verb. It would be a little weird to say, said Bill this. You might understand a person, but you'd say, what's that? What's that about? So in the Hebrew, actually, they reverse. They usually start with the verb and put the subject right after it. That's just the way they think.
We understand Yoda.
Well, exactly so, right? So when you watch the Star Wars series of movies, you get the impression that Yoda didn't grow up speaking English. I don't do a very good Yoda, but anyway. So yeah.
The way he says it, such a Japan does.
All right, will be established. So that's a very prominent thing. That doesn't happen during the last days. It talks about future, but it's talking about it's simply being a fact already. It exists when the last days begin. It's already a feature of the times in which are going to be there when Christ returns. So, Jesus is fulfilling that when it comes about. What is Isaiah describing with all nations will stream to it, to the mountain? And this helps us to interpret what is meant by the last days. When do the nations stream to the faith that was represented by the temple?
The spread of Christianity throughout the world.
How many of you are Jewish? Right? We're the Gentiles. We're the nations. And so, and it's going on. So we see Christianity as being somewhat in the decline in the West. It went through Europe, it came to the Americas through there. The Europeans still think Americans are religious fanatics as much as we seem to be losing our grip. But it's growing by leaps and bounds in Central America. It's growing by leaps and bounds in Southeast Asia. It's growing by leaps and bounds in Sub-Saharan Africa. So the gospel keeps moving. And all nations continue to stream. So in the last days, this happens. It helps us to place ourselves here with what Isaiah is talking about. This is New Testament mission work. And we're going to see this in other places in Isaiah. Generally speaking, in Jesus' day, the Jewish people didn't think much of the Gentiles, the Goy. They didn't like the Goyim, and they thought they were unclean, didn't want anything to do with them. And God had to get them past that. And even the apostles, Peter, God had to kind of wrestle him to take the gospel to Gentile people like the centurion Cornelius. And then after that, they're not so sure the Apostle Paul is doing what he's supposed to be doing when he's working in Antioch or on his first missionary journeys. This took some time for them to figure out. But this is what God wanted. And already in Isaiah, not only here, but in other chapters, we're going to see he's got that in view somewhat. He knows that the day is coming when the true faith isn't just a Jewish thing. And of course, we're the living fulfillment of that. All right, we're past time, or that's a good place to break. We'll pick it up there. Question 4 next week.